President Putin of Russia has admitted to the fuel shortage crisis within Russia. At the same time, he is also appearing to plead, saying that he wants the United States to end this war. Let's take a closer look at this issue today. Let's take a look. Currently, the Ukrainian military is carrying out unlimited airstrikes on Russian territory. As a result, almost all of the oil refineries within Russia are being hit. As a result, Russia is now facing a fuel shortage. A bizarre situation is happening where Russia, one of the world's largest oil exporters, is experiencing a fuel shortage. Because of this, Russia has decided to import gasoline from abroad to solve its fuel shortage problem. Russia importing gasoline from abroad is considered a very unusual move. According to a report by Politico, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, told reporters that discussions for imports are actively underway and that if an agreement is reached at an acceptable price range, they will proceed with the imports. They didn't reveal which countries they're negotiating with, but foreign media mentioned Kazakhstan. Russia is now in crisis. It's the world's second largest crude oil exporter and third largest refined petroleum exporter. Ukrainian drone attacks are forcing large oil refineries to halt operations. It is reported that gasoline production has decreased by about 25%. So far, the Russian parliament has even approved a tax reform bill to create subsidies to support the cost of purchasing gasoline from abroad. A fuel rationing system is being introduced in parts of mainland Russia and the Crimean Peninsula to address the crisis. The Russian Federal State Statistics Service has stopped publishing weekly fuel price reports, and even President Putin can no longer hide the situation. Putin publicly admitted that unfortunately there are long lines at gas stations and people are unable to get the required grade of gasoline in time, acknowledging that fuel supply within Russia is not running smoothly. He specifically noted that farmers and agricultural households face difficulties from fuel shortages in the summer. Since this is the peak season for agricultural activities in Russia, disruptions in fuel supply are bound to affect agricultural production and logistics overall. Putin also stated that he would push for increased production and restore the energy infrastructure damaged by Ukrainian attacks as quickly as possible. However, the fact that the national leader has to directly explain the fuel shortage to the people shows that Russia is under considerable pressure. Also, Putin's diplomatic message has changed a lot compared to before. Until recently, Russia believed it had the upper hand on the front lines and showed a passive attitude toward US attempts to stop the conflict. They also maintained the attitude that there was no reason to rush peace negotiations. However, recently they have begun to publicly emphasize their willingness to negotiate, saying that they are ready to continue talks and discuss all the details. In particular, Putin said that he expects the US delegation to visit Moscow again once the tensions surrounding Iran are resolved. He said they're waiting for the United States to resume negotiations. The main reason for the change in President Putin's remarks is considered to be the rapid improvement in Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities. Since the end of last year, Ukraine has begun to actively deploy long-range suicide drones and UAVs capable of flying over 500 kilometers, and with the addition of its domestically developed long-range cruise missile, Flamingo, it has been continuously attacking the rear areas of Russia. Initially, border military facilities were targeted, but recently attacks have reached deep inside Russia. Now, it's hard to consider any area safe just because it's far from the front lines. Especially, Ukraine has launched what is called the 40-day operation since the 25th, gradually intensifying the long-range airstrikes. The main objective of this operation is not to directly confront Russian military forces. It is to disrupt the supply system and energy infrastructure that enable the continuation of the war. The strategy is to continuously attack oil refineries, storage facilities, and military logistics hubs to reduce Russia's fuel production and transportation capabilities. In fact, on the 28th, they struck oil refineries in Krasnodar and Yaroslavl, which are about 300 kilometers and 700 kilometers away from the Russian border with Ukraine, respectively. Both regions play a key role in Russia's energy supply network. In particular, the fact that there were attacks on facilities located hundreds of kilometers from the border is being seen as evidence that Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities have greatly improved compared to before. For Russia, the burden of having to continuously expand its air defense network to the rear areas is inevitably increasing. Ukraine has also made it clear that it will continue to carry out attacks in this manner going forward. President Zelensky has also stated that he will continue operations to weaken Russia's ability to wage war, so analysts say that long-range airstrikes targeting oil refineries, energy infrastructure, and military supply bases are likely to continue in the future. If this happens, Russia will likely need to commit significant forces and resources to both the front lines and defending key facilities in the rear. As this situation continues, it's clear Russian public sentiment is gradually being shaken. In particular, there have been a series of surveys showing that anxiety about the economy is rapidly growing. According to a survey released by the polling agency Gallup, pessimism about the economic outlook among Russian citizens has reached its highest level in the past 20 years. 60% of respondents said that the economic situation in their region was getting worse, while only 27% said it was improving. Only 9% said there was no change. Assessments of living standards were similar as well. 56% of respondents said their lives had gotten worse than before, 29% said things had improved, and 14% said there was no change. Also, the level of trust Russians have in the military and government has dropped to record lows in just 1 year. Trust in the military fell from 79% to 66%, and trust in the government dropped from 67% to 53%. The percentage of people rating their country's press freedom positively dropped from 59% to 34% in 1 year. What's even more noteworthy is that this survey was conducted from March 14 to May 6 before the fuel supply crisis had fully spread. Even before the recent gasoline shortages and refinery attacks, Russians were already experiencing significant economic anxiety. After that, Ukraine expanded its attacks on Russian oil refineries and energy infrastructure, and in some regions, actual fuel supply restrictions and sales controls were implemented, leading to analyses that the burden felt by the public has grown even greater than before. Additionally, war fatigue is growing more apparent. According to the independent Russian Telegram channel Mozhem Obyaznit, from June 22 to 28, more than 137,000 searches for "When will the special military operation end?" were entered on Yandex, Russia's largest search engine. This is the highest number of searches since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. These searches mainly focused on Moscow and the second largest city, St. Petersburg. The previous record high occurred during the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in early June. At that time, the Ukrainian military also carried out drone attacks towards St. Petersburg during the forum, and interest and anxiety about the prolonged war increased significantly in Russian society. This time, it has even surpassed that record. Although we cannot judge public opinion solely based on search records, the fact that many citizens have started to look up when the war will end themselves shows that the war will affect everyday life. This is being evaluated as one of the indicators showing that the sense of burden and fatigue is gradually increasing. It still appears unlikely that President Putin plans to end the war. Instead, there are signs he's tightening control and preparing for a long conflict. Putin recently signed a bill letting Russia seize property from citizens abroad if they act against the country's interests. This law has passed both the lower and upper houses and is scheduled to take effect on September 1. This law defines a broad range of punishable offenses. This includes not only acts criticizing the Russian military or calling for international sanctions, but also producing or distributing materials authorities consider extremist. Also, not paying related fines can lead to further sanctions, including possible seizure of personal property, not just additional fines. It is known that not only real estate such as apartments, but also bank deposits are subject to seizure. Russia defines extremist activities very broadly, including not just terrorism or violence, but also anti-government actions, separatism, and inciting against certain groups. Since the Russian government defines the Ukrainian leadership as neo-Nazi forces, there is a possibility that activities supporting Ukraine abroad, criticizing Russia's invasion, or calling for sanctions against Russia could also be subject to punishment. In other words, even if Russian citizens are living abroad and engaging in activities there, if the Russian government determines that these actions go against national interests, they could be subject to legal sanctions. The international community is concerned that this law could greatly restrict freedom of expression. Many also interpret it as an attempt to expand control to include Russians living abroad. The Russian government says this protects national security and the constitutional order. State Duma Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin also publicly warned that Russians living abroad can return to the country at any time, but those who insult the Russian military or support Ukraine will not be able to avoid legal responsibility. Looking at these moves, it seems that Putin is responding by further expanding control measures and trying to maintain regime unity, even as internal dissatisfaction grows due to the prolonged war.